So I mentioned in the first episode that I had no clue what I was going to speak about week to week. I was just going to kind of let inspiration find me. And as I finished wrapping up the first episode, naturally, like my mind was wandering to, I wonder what the next one's going to be about. And the funny thing is exactly how my intuition speaks to me. There was one day last week where I literally got beat over the head with 3 things in one day in a row that all had the same theme. So I was scrolling Instagram and I saw this one post. And then a mutual of mine sent me a video and asked my perspective on it. And then right after that, there was another video that I saw on TikTok. And all 3 of them had, from my perspective, the same theme. And this theme is something that I have spoken about privately inside of my membership when my membership was running. I have attempted to speak about it on TikTok and in shorts, but it has never really landed well. And so I felt like that was my intuition saying, yes, Jackie, this is exactly what you need to talk about on your next episode, because the truth is now I can actually get into all of the layers of it and what I'm seeing and what I'm perceiving, and maybe it will resonate with somebody, because fuck, it was not easy. It was not an easy concept for me to integrate. And before I really dig into the meat of this, I feel like it is important to orient the listener. So if you have come here because of my abuse content, I just want a warning that what I'm about to discuss might be very triggering. This episode is not about denying abuse. It's not about minimizing harm. It's not about blaming victims. It's about something much subtler. And I know from experience that certain things need to be reconciled before any of this is going to land. So take this as a warning. If you're in a situation that feels harmful, I just want you to know that your perspective is absolutely valid. Everything that you're experiencing, there is nothing wrong with you. How you feel, what you perceive, it is all valid. It's all part of different stages of the process. And I feel like that is really important to name. And you will understand why, because this specific episode is about how victim consciousness can quietly turn into self-righteous narcissism. Even the people who genuinely believe that they're healing can fall into this. It's something that I experienced myself, and it is something that I am currently witnessing. So this is how it all unfolded. I was scrolling on Instagram, and on my feed came this post, and it was, I don't know if it was a therapist or just somebody, like an abuse or narcissism educator. But she took this letter that was written from a husband to a wife, and she went through the letter and she dissected all of these manipulation and abuse tactics, right? And it was like a carousel. So she went page by page, line by line, outlining what was abuse and manipulation and gaslighting and all of the things. And I opened up first of all, I read the letter, and I had a very different perception of what was happening in that letter. And just out of curiosity, I opened up the comments and I started reading the comments, and they were all, people that were like, absolutely, this is my experience. They're all the same. This sounds like my husband. And it was just like this whole berate fest of very wounded people, coming together to validate one another. Absolutely fine. I totally understand the perspective. Now, I don't know why, but something inside, well, I know why now, but at the time, I had no clue why I felt compelled to comment. I typically do not comment on stuff like this because One, I remember when I was in that space, and anybody that said anything that was outside of validating my experience, I perceived them as a threat and I would attack them. But two, from my current perspective, like, I know precisely the state that they're in, and there is nothing wrong with that state. It's an absolutely valid state, but something inside of me said to comment. And so my comment was very simple. It was, from my perspective, I do not see manipulation, but I understand why everyone here does, and it is valid. Full stop. That was it. That was all I said. Over the next 2 days, I got attacked so bad. And you know, I knew it was going to happen, but it was just so interesting to have that experience. I had people tell me that I'm easily manipulated. I had people tell me that my perception was wrong. I had people say they feel sorry for me, that I'm going to be abused again. I had people tell me that I'm crazy. And you know, what was so interesting is all of the things that these victims were doing is precisely what they accuse narcissistic people of doing, right? Like denying my reality, telling me I'm crazy. All of that, from their perspective, can be perceived as gaslighting. One of them actually jumped on my main page, on my page, and commented on my videos like, "Don't listen to this woman. She shouldn't work with abuse victims." One person told me that I was invalidating them. And the experience reminded me a lot of what I experienced in one of my relationships, where I was validating somebody's feelings and their thoughts and their perceptions, but because I wasn't agreeing with them, they told me that I was invalidating them, that I was abusive, that I was blame shifting, and all of the things. So like, I had already had this lived experience from that perspective before. Of the 6 or 7 people that responded to my comment, there was actually only one person that was genuinely curious about my perception. The lady said that she followed me on Instagram and she always valued my insight, but that she was curious about what I was perceiving because the letter sounded like her ex-husband. All of these things were happening, and it was a really interesting experience to be a part of. Now, the second experience I had, a mutual had tagged me in a video about somatic abuse. Now, I haven't been in the abuse space for so long, like I don't even get that type of content across my feed anymore. But somatic abuse is something that I had never heard of. Like, when I was in that space, nobody was talking about it. And essentially, from what I gathered, it's when somebody's nervous system encroaches on your nervous system. And I understand that from a felt experience, it can be intrusive, because the reality is we all have auras, right? Like, I have an aura around me, you have an aura around you. Inside my aura is my energy, it's my thoughts, it's my trauma. Everything lives in an energetic field around me, and yours does the same for you. And so if you're in some kind of dysregulated state, if you're in survival, for example, all of that energy is going to live in your field. And so if I have a hypersensitivity to energy, I'm going to be able to feel that. And this is exactly what this somatic therapist was describing as somatic abuse. And I just had such a problem with that, because it moves the definition of abuse from behavior, which is what it is, a series of behaviors that are rooted in power and control, that are coercive, that override autonomy. So if we're no longer talking about behavior and we're talking about nervous system states, now abuse is moving entirely into the realm of impact over intent. And I feel like this is a large problem in a lot of the online relational spaces, where impact is being perceived as more important than intent. And that's problematic, because if I have a lot of unresolved trauma, If I have a nervous system that isn't grounded, that isn't rooted in self-safety, that seeks external validation, then I'm going to perceive somebody's behaviors through a very different lens than somebody who has a regulated nervous system. And which is why abuse is about intent. Intent does matter because I cannot control the impact. Just the last example where I validated the experience, but people were telling me that I was invalidating them simply by having a different opinion, by not agreeing with them, right? So the narrative around impact versus intent has gotten really muddy. And then finally, the third experience was just another video of a lady explaining something that her husband, partner, whatever, said while they were breaking up. He said things like, I was never good enough for you. I just want somebody that loves me. And in the abuse space, these things are always perceived as manipulation and gaslighting. From my current perspective, I just hear somebody expressing their inner world. And because I have learned to hold duality, because I understand that everybody's perspective is a reflection of their lived experiences, their belief systems, their unprocessed or processed stuff, every single perspective is valid. In the abuse space, there is this all or nothing fight, right? And victims are not seeing that the all or nothing fight, the black and white thinking, is precisely what is causing all of the dissonance that they experience in these types of relationships. The cognitive dissonance of an abusive relationship. Are they good or are they bad? Are they the victim or are they the villain? Which one are they? Well, we're humans and we're complex and we're both. A lot of the content online perpetuates this all or nothing black and white lens, which is just keeping people in a state of, well, all or nothing thinking is survival. It's survival thinking. The ego takes over and hijacks the brain, right? So what I have noticed amongst all three of these episodes and my own personal lived experience is when somebody organizes their life around victimhood, when everything is being perceived through the lens of I was a victim, then your nervous system kind of requires there to be a villain. Your worldview depends on threat needing to be real. A lot of people leave these types of relationships and they say things like, I can never trust again. Everybody out there is going to harm me. And I understand why that can feel very real. But at the same time, narratives like that keep you in victim consciousness and they filter the way that you perceive the world. And then being a victim becomes part of your identity. When you make victimhood a part of your identity, somebody's neutrality feels like erasure. Like when I said, hey, I understand your experience. I understand your perspective. I have a different one. There's a threat detection, and by this person having this belief, it means that my experience is invalid. No, your experience is valid. Again, it goes down to the all or nothing, right? And I think the fascinating thing is that I used to be this way. You can go back and look at content that I made where people would say, you're just stuck in victim consciousness. And I remember it very explicitly. There was this one woman that continued to show up in my content, and she would show up, she would tell me that I'm perpetuating codependency and victim consciousness and all of these things, and I would end up blocking her, and then she would create a new account and she would come in again, and she probably came in 4 or 5 times. And so I started watching her page, and her page was basically she was calling everybody narcissists. Everybody's either like an overt narcissist or a vulnerable narcissist, and they all come together and until somebody wakes up and, figures it all out. And I remember blown away at the time. I was like, this lady is absolutely nuts. And why does she keep coming to my page? Why is she, doing all of this? But I remember at the time, like, I was so certain that the way I was perceiving things was the correct way. And then somebody coming in to tell me that she actually would tell me that I'm wrong. That is not what I did on that Instagram post, but she would come in and she was pretty aggressive and she told me that I was wrong. But somebody coming in and telling me, you're perceiving it wrong, it triggers your threat detection. Like, my ego was still, or my identity was still organized around being a victim and helping victims and healing from abuse and all of those things. That was a big part of my identity. That anything that came along to threaten that would make me feel uncomfortable, and I would get on fight. It would activate my fight response. And I probably had like 4 or 5 video replies to this lady's comments because I was absolutely triggered by her. And so from the perspective that I am in now, having lived through that, like been on the receiving end of that, and now seeing where I am now, I live from a space where everybody's perspective is valid, where, just because you share your experience and it's different from your experience, we don't have to pick and choose which one is right and which one is wrong. Both of them can be right. And I think this is the hardest thing for a lot of victims and me. Like, when I was in that space and I was dealing with my ex, it was really difficult for me to, like, I understood his experience. I understood why he was perceiving everything the way that he did, but I didn't agree with it. I wasn't able to truly say, yes, that's valid, because I wasn't in his state. I was in a different state. And so my whole understanding of narcissism has changed, because in the 3D space, in relationship spaces and in therapeutic spaces, we are taught that narcissism, like, we talk about narcissism as it's like a personality disorder. And it absolutely is. I'm not denying that. The way I currently perceive narcissism is that it's like an energetic frequency that people who are in survival operate from. Even thinking of myself, where I would villainize abusers, villainize narcissists. They're doing this to harm you. They're doing this to hurt you. And all of that was to continue to feed my own victim narrative. The moral superiority that exists in being a victim. I don't think a lot of people realize. They can't perceive it. Think about the people in my comments that were completely denying my reality, were, twisting my words and telling me that I was invalidating them when I was actually validating them. They were living from impact over intent and like all of these things. The most humbling thing for me in my own personal growth and development was recognizing that narcissism is a state. It's a state rooted in survival, where your ego is constantly scanning for threat. And that exists as both the people who are overtly controlling, and the people who are passive and pleasing engage in their narcissism in a different way, whereas it's about moral superiority. It's about, I'm better than you. And neither of them are wrong. They're both survival states. And so for the longest time, my narcissism looked like pointing the fingers at other people. I believed that they were morally inferior to me, and it wasn't until I fully was able to claim and integrate my own narcissism, basically identify where I was perceiving the world through a narcissistic lens, that I was able to collapse that. So now I'm in a state where I am able to hold all of it. I both can perceive abuse and I don't perceive abuse. I can perceive that there is one space, one state where abuse exists, and then there is another state where it doesn't exist. I think the most difficult thing for people to do is to be able to hold duality. And when you are actually able to do that, when you're able to say that harm can exist without intent, and that abuse is real and not everything is abuse, and that someone else's experience doesn't negate your own, when you're able to remove the threat detection of somebody else having a perspective, a thought, an emotion, an experience that is different than yours, just because somebody can experience something different than you, it doesn't make your experience invalid. And I don't think a lot of people recognize that that is actually the wounded inner child coming out saying, please, please, please validate me, because I have not yet learned how to validate myself. And from my experience, the key to reconciling all of this is learning self-validation. Because if you're still chasing someone to validate your story, to validate your experience, to validate what you perceive, you're going to be there forever. The integration of all of these things makes you less attached to being right. If this episode was triggering for you, I encourage you to sit with yourself, because all of our triggers are mirrors into the parts of ourself that we have not yet reconciled. And, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just showing you where your edges live. And it's an invitation to explore it if you want to. You can choose to not, right? That's the beauty of personal development work, is it's a choice. I find that the more I eliminate my triggers, the more peaceful life becomes. So it is absolutely okay to honor a part of your story where you perceived yourself as a victim. My true freedom came when I no longer allowed that to be a part of my identity. And that included working through all of the things where I perceived my victimhood was being challenged. So maybe this resonates, maybe it doesn't. Either way, it's okay. I just want to assure you that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. You're not behind, you're not late. So thank you for hanging out with me today, and until next time.